My name is Dr. Jay Cardinale, and each week I teach a small group lesson based on Lifeway's Explore the Bible curriculum. So I want to encourage you to grab your copy of Scripture and learn with me from the life of Joseph and his brothers about what it means to be reconciled to one another. Now, I'm a reader. I love to read. You might say, oh, you read leadership books and you read commentaries, and you read all these things. I do read those, but I love a good novel. I love to sit down and figure out what's going to happen next. And in some novels, you have the plot twist. You're like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. Well, today in the book of Genesis, as the readers, we know what's coming because Moses told us, but the people in the story don't. They are going to experience a plot twist. Their lives are going to be shocked and rocked. And so we're going to look and see what happens when Joseph's brothers discover that he is still alive. We've been looking at their life for a while, and we know now Joseph is in Egypt. He's in charge. The famine has finally come. We had 7 years of plenty, and we're 2 years into the famine. And Moses is going to take us back to Canaan. He's going to take us back to Joseph's family. We're going to see they are in need. They need some food. So they decide they're going to go to Egypt, where everybody else is going, and we're going to go buy some food from this government official who has saved up enough food to feed the world. So they do. They go back, and they encounter Joseph. They don't know who Joseph is. They don't recognize him. It could have just been the fact that it's been almost 20 years or more since they've seen him last. It could be the fact that he is Egyptianized. It could be the fact that they just think he's dead, but they don't recognize this government official standing before them. So Joseph begins to present before them some tests. It's a way to see if their character has changed over the years. You see, all the brothers are there except for one. Benjamin is still back home because Joseph's dad didn't want to let Benjamin go to this foreign country. Didn't want anything bad to happen to him. So Joseph, with these tests, he brings them back a second time. And this time, he has them bring Benjamin with them. And through some more tests and trying to see if they are the same guys that they were when he was younger, he finally says to them, we're going to enslave Benjamin. Benjamin's staying here with me. They don't know he knows who he is, but they're scared for their younger brother. They're scared for Benjamin. And finally, Judah steps up, the oldest one. He steps up and he announces to this government official who is threatening to enslave their brother, he announced to him, take me. Look at Genesis chapter 44, verse 33 and 34. Judah says, now please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave, in place of the boy. Let him go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father without the boy? I could not bear to see the grief that would overcome my father. In Judah's impassioned plea to the government official, he has inadvertently revealed something about himself. He has revealed that he is not the man he was 20 years ago. He has revealed that he has changed. He cares for Benjamin. He's worried about what's going to happen to his father. And in that impassioned plea before this government official, we see a changed man. And Joseph sees a changed man. And Joseph is going to respond in like manner. Look at Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 3. Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all his attendants, so he called out, send everyone away from me. No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Now, let's consider this situation from the brothers' perspective. This government official, he's treated them weirdly. He's been hostile toward them. He's been very stern with them. But also, he's had them into his house for a meal where he seated them in order of their ages. There's something weird happening, and they're kind of scared of this guy. And he is arguably the most powerful person outside of Pharaoh around them in the whole region. And suddenly, he sends everybody out. And he says to them, I'm your brother. And he breaks down crying. He's hysterical. It's so loud they can hear it all over the palace, all over where he lives. And suddenly the brothers, they can't speak. They're terrified. Why do you think they're terrified? they might be afraid because this frankly hysterical government official is just like breaking down crying and saying crazy things. They might be afraid because maybe suddenly their eyes are open. They're like, oh, no. Wait, the young weakling who we tortured, threw in a pit, sold into slavery, told our daddy was dead, that guy is now running Egypt. He now has the power to repay evil with evil. Well, we don't know why exactly they're terrified, but they're terrified. But Joseph says, I'm Joseph, how's dad? I'm Joseph, how's our father? You see, Joseph, it's almost like a run-on sentence. Joseph isn't even concerned about the current situation. He's not worried about his brothers right now. He's not worried about the famine right now. He's worried about dad. He's worried about his family. Joseph is seeking reconciliation. He's been doing all these things to these men so that he can find out if they're worthy of being reconciled with and if he's ready to be reconciled with them. And now he is. He understands they've changed and he wants to be reconciled. So I want you to stop and I want you to really consider this question. Why do people long for reconciliation and why are they frightened about it? Reconciliation is hard because it's filled with mixed emotions. We might desire it, but there's still negativity there. There's still strife there. There's still old hurts there. As followers of Jesus, we should do what we can to bring about reconciliation. It's going to be hard. It's going to be awkward. And a reconciled family might not be a family that suddenly has Sunday lunch together. It might not be that way. But reconciliation should be looked for, and we should try and get it. It's going to include a lot of apologies. It's going to include a lot of forgiving. It might even include some counseling that will allow us a safe place to share our emotions and our hurts with one another so that we can bring about reconciliation. Joseph's been working on this for a while. He didn't just wake up one day when his brothers came and said, I want to be reconciled with these guys. No, he's been working on this for a while. Through all these years of growing and working in Egypt and being enslaved and being in prison, he's been working on this for a while. Moses tells us that when Joseph had his first son, he named him Manasseh. Look with me at Genesis chapter 41, verses 51 through 52. Joseph named him Manasseh and said, God has made me forget all my hardships and my whole family. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my afflictions. Joseph hasn't completely forgotten his family. But what God has done in Joseph's life has allowed Joseph to set aside those negative feelings. It's been a long time. It's been a lot of work. But Joseph has set aside what's happened to him. And he's beginning to seek reconciliation with his brothers. You can be reminded that reconciliation doesn't begin in my heart. Reconciliation doesn't necessarily begin in another person's heart. Reconciliation begins with the work of the Lord in our life. God has been working on Joseph for a long time to get him to where he is. And Joseph has said, I'm Joseph, how's our father? And then what happens next? Look at Genesis 45, 4 through 8. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. And they came near. I'm Joseph, your brother, he said, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. If we stop and consider this passage, we're going to see some very powerful and some very difficult words for those who have suffered at the hands of others. I think we can see 3 main points. First, we see the confusing nature of human existence, the confounding nature of human relationships, and the clarifying nature of godly understanding. If we reflect on the life of Joseph, we're going to see that he experienced some lows in life and some highs in life. His lows were really low. His highs were really high. He was low in a pit. He was sold into the lowly station of a slave. He was imprisoned for something he didn't do. Low lows. But the high highs, he was placed in charge of Potiphar's house. He was the son of a rich man in Canaan. He was placed in charge of Egypt, the second only to Pharaoh himself. He had some really high highs. If you think about Joseph's life, it might just seem arbitrary. Things happened to Joseph, one thing after another. This happened, that happened, this happened, that happened. It might just seem arbitrary. In our life today, we might experience some lows and some highs, and it might just seem that life is happening to us. Life just keeps coming at us, and there's no rhyme or reason to the good and the bad. It just happens. That's the worldly perspective. There's also a heavenly perspective, and we're going to talk about that. But just from a worldly perspective, I want you to think about something. People think life just happens. What are some of the effects of seeing life as just a series of random events with no greater purpose? Those who see life as just a series of random events, we live, we die, life happens to us. Those folks, those people, which is the majority of people, they see no purpose in life. There's no reason for this. It's just we live and die and that's it, and oh well. And when that happens, we begin to seek our own purpose. And since the heart is desperately wicked, that purpose often becomes ourself, our pleasure, our desires. What's going to make my life at least tolerable until I die? Our purpose becomes ourselves. Joseph could have gotten to that point. He had all the power in the world. He could have just focused on himself, but he found his way to reconciliation. And he did that because he understood there's more to this world than this world. There's another world out there. There's more to this, and he came to understand that. But also, Joseph understands something about human relationships. They are confounding. Joseph understood that relationships mark us. In many ways, they make us who we are. After announcing to his brothers that I'm Joseph, your brother, he asked them to come closer. Come closer. And then he proves that he is Joseph. He says, remember, I'm the one who sold into slavery. You see, Joseph understood that he had to prove who he was, but this announcement could have frightened the brothers. It could have terrified them, reminded them of what they've done, because Joseph also knew that family relationships are fractious. But Joseph says, don't grieve yourself about that. Don't grieve about that. That's not important right now. I'm your brother. I'm family. You know, we can't always choose our family. We're kind of born into it. Sometimes the family we're born into and the family we live with is not always perfect and nice and pretty, but they're still family. And Joseph knew that. Joseph knew these guys. They had messed up, but their character had changed. They had grown up. They had developed, and Joseph knew that. And so Joseph says, hey, we're family, guys. So that causes us to ask a question about relationships. Why is it sometimes more difficult to forgive a family member than a friend or an acquaintance? Family relationships are usually more close-knit than those of our friends or our acquaintances. You know, there's just something about growing up in a house with somebody, experiencing Christmas mornings together with a family. There's something about that causes it to be more close-knit. But there's also the reason that slights, disputes, hurts, the reason those are harder to forgive. The reason those are harder to bring into reconciliation. But see, as followers of Jesus, like Joseph, we need to seek out reconciliation. Now, it should be pointed out that there are instances like abuse or trauma or something like that that's going to require a lot more wisdom and a lot more godly counseling and counsel to move through that. Sometimes situations like that might just require an individual, personal, and spiritual reconciliation. I don't know. Every situation is unique. So if in situations like that, we need to seek guidance. We need to seek godly counsel and godly wisdom before we move forward. But we should be striving to reconcile with people, even if it's just an individual heart thing. But Joseph, in his situation, he had found a way to do that, found a way to reconcile with his brothers, reconcile with his family. And he did that through these ways, but also through an understanding of who God is. In his welcome speech to his brothers, he focuses attention not on himself. He focuses the attention not on what they've done, but on what the Lord has done. Joseph, it appears, has spent the past 20 years praying about the situation, thinking about the situation, thinking about who the Lord is and who his brothers are and who he is. He's been working through this, and at this point, he points to the Lord in 3 different ways. He said, God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant. Therefore, it was not you who sent me, but God. Through the work of God in the heart of Joseph, he had come to a place where he could reconcile with his brothers because he had come to a place where he understands who he is and understands who God is. He's not absolving his brothers of sin. They're still the ones who sold him into slavery. But what he's saying, he said, guys, don't think about that. Don't grieve over that because I know why it happened. It holds no power over me. I'm not stewing in that. I'm over it. I'm done with it. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. God has made it so that I don't have to worry about that anymore. I don't have to think on that anymore because I know that God had a plan. God had a purpose. Those things have shaped me, and God has worked in my life so I was able to do what God had for me to do. God had great plans. God works his will even in evil actions, even in the things that people mean for bad. God still can use that for good. Paul writes on that. In Romans 8:28, he says, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. Bad and difficult things are still bad and difficult, but they can serve a greater good. They can serve a greater purpose in our life. God can bring us through those things so God can use those things to do great things. What are those great things? Well, just at their core, it is our good, which is a conformity to Christ's image and God's glory, through revealing his purpose and accomplishing his purpose in people's lives. Trials and sufferings can be hard, but they serve a purpose, and Joseph realized that. The New Testament writers realized that as well. James 1, 2, and 3 tell us, consider it great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. 1 Peter 1, 6 through 7 says, you rejoice in this, even though now for a short time, if necessary, you suffer grief in various trials, so that the proven character of your faith, more valued than gold, which, though perishable, is refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus. Our good, conformity, God's glory, accomplishing his purposes. We should stop and ruminate on that for just a moment. How can having a proper understanding of God affect our ability to forgive others and be reconciled to them? Joseph wasn't just theologizing so that his brothers would have a better intellectual understanding of who God is. Joseph was telling them this so they would not be grieved. A proper understanding of who God is, how God relates to us, and who we are in relation to God changes everything about us. It changes our thoughts. It changes our emotions. It changes the way we act. It enables us to reconcile with others. We forgive because we've been forgiven. We reconcile with others because God has reconciled us to himself. Joseph understands that, and we can understand that. We can understand that God can use the bad things so that we can, in our lives, so that we can invest in other people who've experienced similar things. We can understand that God changes us and grows us and shapes us so that we can invest in the next generation so they don't experience the same things that we experienced. Joseph is trying to help his brothers understand this. Joseph has come to the point where he can reconcile with his brothers. He's standing before them, and he says to them, God has brought you here for a reason. He wants you to be a remnant in Egypt. You see, God had a plan not just for Joseph's life and his brothers' lives, but God had a bigger worldwide plan that began with Abraham and is moving forward, and Joseph plays a big part in it. Let's see what that big plan is and how Joseph played a role in it. Look at Genesis chapter 45, verses 9 through 15. Return quickly to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You can settle in the land of Goshen and be near me. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all you have. There I will sustain you. For there will be 5 more years of famine. Otherwise, you, your household, and everything you have will become destitute. Look, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin can see that I am the one speaking to you. Tell my father about all my glory in Egypt and about all you have seen, and bring my father here quickly." Then Joseph threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as they wept, and afterward his brothers talked with him. Joseph demonstrates his emotional and spiritual reconciliation with his brothers by embracing them, by sitting down and catching up over 20 years worth of life, telling them all about his time in Egypt, asking about probably the kids and the grandkids and all these things going on. They sit and they embrace and they talk. And this isn't just a family reunion, though. There's more going on here. There's covenantal and eschatological implications for what's taking place. You see, God had told Abraham, "I'm going to make you a blessing so that you can be a blessing to the nations." God had brought Joseph to Egypt, sent him ahead and given him power and authority and the ability to save his family, because God never intended for the family to die out in Canaan during this famine. God had a plan. From this nation would come kings. From this family would come the King of Kings, who would die for the nations. You see, God had a plan, and Joseph played a part in that. Joseph could have been spiteful. Joseph could have imprisoned his brothers. Joseph could have his brothers killed. He was powerful. He could do whatever he wanted to. But instead, over 20 years, he had been conformed to the image of Christ. He had been conformed to what God wanted him to be so he could play a part in God's greater purpose and God's greater plan. You see, our interpersonal relationships, they can impact people negatively. But when we live like Christ calls us to live, those interpersonal relationships can be reconciled. They can serve a greater purpose. They can impact generations and generations to come. Joseph shows us that. God had a plan to save the world. It began with Abraham, and it came to fruition in Jesus, and Joseph played a part because Joseph decided to forgive. Joseph decided to be reconciled. But I think we can conclude our lesson today by remembering that Joseph took the initiative with his brothers, and God takes the initiative with us. 2 Corinthians 5:19 tells us that is in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and he has committed the message of reconciliation to us. The message of reconciliation that God gives us when God initiates our salvation and saves us, that message of reconciliation is the gospel, and it is for all people. But it begins with those closest to us. Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. "So if you are offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift." Before we do the worshipful work of the kingdom, before we do anything for God, we have to participate in reconciliation. We have to be reconciled to our brothers and sisters in Christ and in family. We have to do the work, the hard work of forgiving, the hard work of experiencing forgiveness. And when we do that, we then can do great things for God, because God can use those things to further his kingdom. Y'all, it's hard. Reconciliation is hard. And like I said before, there are some things that require a lot of extra work and a lot of counseling and those things like that. But we should do our part in being reconciled, because God wants to use us to do great things. So I'm going to challenge you this week. If there are things in your life that you need to deal with and you need to ask forgiveness for, do that. If there are things in your life that you need to deal with and forgive others about, begin the process of doing that. It's hard work, but the Lord is with you, and the Lord will help you do that with the godly counsel of others and the wisdom of others as you walk forward in reconciliation. I encourage you to begin the process of praying on that and doing that this week. I'll see you next week.